A coat on a hook was a promise he couldn't keep. Please, just for the boy. The words were almost stolen by the wind, a dry rasp against the endless scrape of dust on wood. He heard them anyway. Elias stood on the porch of his cabin, the raw planks weathered to the color of bone, and watched the woman. She stood beside the wreck of her wagon, one will splintered like a dead man's grin. A child, no more than 5 or 6, huddled against her skirt, his small face buried in the faded calico. The wind whipped her hair across her face and tore at the thin shawl around her shoulders, but she did not flinch. She just stared at him, her gaze direct and stripped of everything but a raw, desperate plea. He had seen them coming for the last hour, a slow, limping speck on the vast, unforgiving plains. He had watched as the wheel finally gave way, the wagon lurching with a sound he could feel in his teeth even from 100 yards off. He had stayed on the porch, unmoving, a part of him hoping they would simply disappear, another mirage swallowed by the heat shimmer. They did not. Elias shifted his weight, the leather of his boots groaning. His silence was a wall he had built stone by heavy stone over years of solitude. It was his fortress. He looked past her, to the horizon where the sun was a blistering eye, bleeding orange and purple into the bruised sky. Another day ending. Another night coming. The nights were cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and reminded you that you were alone. He knew that cold well. The woman did not repeat herself. She held his gaze, her chin lifted. There was no weakness in her stance, only an exhaustion so profound it seemed to be the only thing holding her upright. It was the child who broke the standoff. The boy peeked out from behind his mother's legs, his eyes wide and dark in a face smudged with dirt and tears. He looked at Elias, then at the water barrel by the porch steps, his small tongue darting out to wet his cracked lips. That single, small movement did what her words could not. It breached the wall, found a crack in the stone and pushed through. Elias felt a familiar, unwelcome ache in his chest, a ghost of a feeling he had long ago packed away in a dark corner of his memory. He thought of another boy, another time. The thought was a splinter of glass, sharp and quick. He pushed it down. He gave a short, curt nod. It was more a twitch of his neck than a real gesture, but she understood. The tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. She waited. Elias turned without a word and went back inside his cabin. The single room was sparse, neat, and smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and solitude. A narrow bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a stone hearth. On the wall, by the door, a single wooden peg held a man's heavy sheepskin coat. Next to it, another peg sat empty, a faint circle in the wood dust marking where something else had once hung for a very long time. In the corner, shadowed and still, sat a small wooden rocking chair, its arms worn smooth. He ignored it, his eyes fixed on the task at hand. He picked up a tin cup from the dry sink, filled it from the bucket of clean water, and walked back outside. He didn't hand it to her. He set it on the top step of the porch and backed away, creating a space of neutral ground between them. She watched him, her eyes missing nothing. Then she gently guided her son forward. The boy, Leo, approached the step as if it were a wild animal. He picked up the cup with 2 hands and drank, his small throat working. He drank until it was empty, then looked back at his mother, a single drop of water clinging to his chin. She knelt and wiped his mouth with her thumb. She looked back at Elias, her expression unreadable. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, and the air was growing teeth. The wind moaned, a lonely sound that echoed the emptiness inside him. He knew he should send them away. He knew he should tell them the next town was a 2-day walk, and wish them luck. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. He cleared his throat, the sound rough from disuse. The barn. You can stay in the barn. He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked toward the large, weathered structure that stood silhouetted against the dying light. He heard the soft scuff of her worn boots in the dirt behind him. He heard the child's smaller, stumbling steps. They followed, a quiet procession into the encroaching dark. He slid the heavy barn door open, the wood groaning in protest. Inside, it smelled of hay and dust and animals long gone. A few shafts of twilight pierced the gloom through cracks in the walls. It was shelter. It was something. He left them there, at the threshold, and retreated back to the silence of his cabin, the ghost of the boy's thirsty gaze burning behind his eyes. A change had come to his quiet world. It had arrived in a broken wagon, with the sound of a woman's desperate plea. He closed his cabin door, but the silence inside was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of two strangers in his barn, and the unwelcome stirring of his own buried past. The cabin was a small bubble of warmth against the vast, cold dark. Elias moved with the practiced economy of a man long accustomed to his own company. He lit the lantern, its yellow glow pushing back the shadows but not the memories they held. He stirred the embers in the hearth, adding a log from the woodbox. The fire caught, spitting and crackling, a lively sound in the otherwise silent room. He prepared his own meager supper, a piece of hardtack softened in the last of the day's coffee. He ate standing by the hearth, his gaze fixed on the flames, but his thoughts were outside, in the barn. He thought of the woman's hands, chapped and raw but steady as she'd wiped her son's mouth. He thought of the boy's thin shoulders under his dusty shirt. The barn was dry, but the wind found its way through every crack, and the temperature would drop sharply before dawn. The hay was loose and would offer some warmth, but it wouldn't be enough. Not for a child. The ache in his chest returned, sharper this time. He set his cup down with a clatter that sounded unnaturally loud. He went to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, folded neatly, were linens he hadn't touched in years. He pulled out a thick wool blanket, dark gray and heavy. It smelled faintly of cedar and disuse. He closed the chest, the soft thud of the lid sealing away the memories once more. He hesitated for a moment, the blanket heavy in his arms. This was a line he hadn't intended to cross. Offering the barn was one thing. Offering comfort was another. He walked back to the hearth. A pot of thin stew simmered on the iron hook over the fire. He'd made enough for 2 days, as was his habit. He ladled a generous portion into a tin bowl, his movements stiff. With the bowl in one hand and the blanket in the other, he stepped back out into the night. The wind cut at him instantly, colder now that the sun was fully gone. A sliver of moon offered little light, but he knew the path by heart. As he approached the barn, he saw a faint flicker of light from within. They had a lantern of their own, its fuel likely as low as their hopes. He stopped before the great door, his resolve wavering. He could leave the items outside, a silent offering to be discovered. It would be easier. It would maintain the distance. But then he heard a sound from within, a soft, ragged cough from the child. It was a small sound, almost lost in the wind, but it decided him. He slid the door open just enough to slip through and closed it behind him, plunging the space into a contest between his lantern's steady glow and their lantern's tired flicker. The woman was on her feet in an instant, moving to place herself between him and the boy. The child was nestled in a pile of hay, wrapped in his mother's thin shawl. Her face, illuminated from below by the lantern at her feet, was a mask of fierce, wary protection. Her eyes were shadowed, but he could feel their intensity. She said nothing. Her silence was a challenge. He did not approach her. He walked to a clean, flat-topped bale of hay a few feet away from them and set down the bowl of stew. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of salt and meat into the dusty air. He then unfolded the heavy wool blanket and laid it beside the bowl. He met her gaze across the space. His own expression was impassive, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. For the boy, he said. The words were gravelly. He saw the flicker of conflict in her eyes. Pride warred with necessity. Suspicion warred with the undeniable needs of her child. She looked from Elias's stoic face to the steaming bowl, then to the thick blanket. She glanced down at her son, who had stirred and was watching them with wide, fever-bright eyes. The boy coughed again, a dry, hollow sound that echoed in the vast emptiness of the barn. Her pride broke. A barely perceptible nod was her only answer. She did not thank him. He had not expected her to. He had offered provisions, not friendship. He turned and left as silently as he had come, sliding the heavy door shut behind him. Back in his cabin, the fire seemed warmer, the silence less oppressive. He sat in one of the two chairs at his table, staring at the empty one opposite him. He hadn't offered her a place in his home. He had drawn a line at the barn door. He was a man who lived by lines, by boundaries he had drawn around his life and his heart. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he felt the edges of those boundaries begin to blur. He had fed a hungry child. He had offered a warm blanket against the cold. They were small acts, simple acts, but they felt momentous. They were seeds planted in the barren soil of his solitude. He did not know if they would grow or what they would become. He only knew that the ground was no longer entirely fallow. He sat there for a long time, listening to the fire and the wind, while in the barn, a mother wrapped her sick child in a stranger's blanket and fed him warm stew from a stranger's bowl. The days fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Each morning, Elias would rise before the sun, his movements practiced and sure in the pre-dawn gloom. He would tend the fire, make coffee, and step out onto the porch to read the sky. His gaze would inevitably drift to the barn. He never saw them emerge, but he knew they were there. The presence of the broken wagon in his yard was a constant, solid reminder. He established a routine for them, a system that required no words. After his own breakfast, he would leave a small portion of food, a piece of jerky, a tin of beans, whatever he had, on the flat top of a large stump that stood halfway between the cabin and the barn. It became their meeting place, a silent post office for sustenance. A few hours later, when he returned from checking his fences or tending his few cattle, the food would be gone. In its place would be the clean-washed tin bowl and cup from the night before. He never saw her take the food. He never saw her return the dishes. It was as if the exchange were carried out by ghosts. He respected her need for distance, for he had the same need himself. Their separate orbits were maintained, their gravities acknowledged but never intersecting. Yet, the routine itself was a form of connection, a thread of dependence and provision that bound them together. Sarah, for her part, held to the barn as if it were a fortress. She was grateful for the shelter and the food, a deep, aching gratitude that she kept hidden behind a wall of caution. This man, Elias, was a mystery. He was grim and silent, yet he had shown them a kindness she had not encountered in a very long time. It was a confusing, unsettling combination. She had learned the hard way that kindness from strange men often came with a price she was unwilling to pay. So she watched. From the shadows of the barn doorway, she watched him. She saw the way he moved, with a purpose that spoke of deep familiarity with his land and his work. She saw the strength in his back as he mended a fence, the patience in his hands as he reshod his horse. He was a man rooted to this place, a part of the landscape itself. She and Leo were tumbleweeds, blown in by a harsh wind, and she knew they would have to blow on again as soon as the wagon was mended. If it could be mended. The boy, Leo, was less constrained by caution. His world had shrunk to the dusty patch of earth around the wagon and the hay-scented gloom of the barn, and Elias was the most interesting feature in it. He would sit just inside the barn door, his small legs dangling, and watch the cowboy for hours. He saw Elias draw water from the well. He saw him chop wood, the axe rising and falling in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Elias was aware of the boy's scrutiny. He could feel the child's eyes on his back. He never acknowledged it. He continued his work as if he were alone, his movements economical and precise. But he found himself altering his path, moving from the well to the woodpile in a way that kept him in the boy's line of sight. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he was just doing his chores. But a part of him, a part he refused to acknowledge, was aware of his small, silent audience. One afternoon, he saw Sarah sitting in the sliver of sun by the barn door, mending a tear in Leo's shirt. Her head was bent, her fingers moving slowly, painstakingly. He saw the thread snap. He saw the quiet slump of her shoulders, a small gesture of defeat. He knew she had little, and that her thread was likely old and weak. He said nothing. He did nothing. He finished his work and went inside his cabin as the sun began to set. He prepared their evening meal, the same simple stew as before. He took it out to the stump, along with the now customary blanket for the cold night. But this time, tucked beside the bowl, he left something else. A small new spool of thick, black thread and a packet of sharp, polished needles he'd stored away in his chest. He turned and walked back to the cabin without a backward glance. He had offered another provision, another small repair for a life that was as frayed as an old shirt. He was mending things quietly, from a distance. The next morning, when he went to retrieve the empty bowl, it was there as always. Beside it, drawn in the dust with a small finger, was a crude but recognizable picture of a horse. It was a thank you. It was a message sent across the silent divide. He stood looking at it for a long moment, then he scuffed it away with the toe of his boot before anyone could see. But he could not erase the image from his mind. A storm was brewing in the west, the clouds piling up on the horizon, the color of a deep bruise. He could feel the change in the air. The spool of thread was a small thing, but it felt enormous. When Sarah found it on the stump that evening, nestled beside the familiar bowl of stew, she stared at it for a full minute. Her first instinct was suspicion. It was followed by a wave of shame so powerful it made her feel dizzy. This man had offered them shelter, food, and warmth, and her first thought was to question his motives. She picked up the spool. It was heavy, full. The needles were in a neat paper packet, sharp and new. She thought of the dozen times her own worn thread had snapped that afternoon. She looked toward the cabin, where a single light glowed in the window, a solitary beacon in the growing dark. He was in there. He had seen her struggle and had provided a solution without a word, without any expectation of thanks. A crack formed in the wall she had built around her heart. It was small, but it was there. She took the provisions back to the barn, her steps lighter than they had been in months. That night, under the flickering lantern light, she mended Leo's shirt with the strong, new thread. The stitches were small and even. It felt like she was mending something more than just cloth. A few nights later, she was jolted awake by a sound from outside. It was a soft, rhythmic grating noise. Her heart leaped into her throat. She crept to a crack in the barn wall and peered out. In the pale moonlight, she saw him. Elias. He was crouched by the broken wheel of her wagon. He had a small saw in his hand and was carefully, quietly, cutting away the splintered spokes. He worked for nearly an hour, his movements precise and unhurried, shaping a new piece of seasoned wood he must have had in his workshop. He was fixing her wagon. He was preparing the means of her departure. The thought should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like a loss. He was helping them move on. She watched until he was finished, until he had gathered his tools and disappeared back into the dark of his cabin. She returned to her bed of hay. The image of his patient hands burned into her mind. The next day, the world changed. The sky, which had been threatening for days, finally broke. The wind came first, a low moan that escalated into a shrieking howl. It tore at the roof of the barn and sent dust devils dancing across the yard. The temperature plummeted. The rain began not as drops, but as sheets of icy water, driven almost horizontally by the gale. The world outside the barn dissolved into a gray, roaring chaos. Sarah and Leo huddled in the deepest part of the barn, wrapped in the wool blanket, but the cold was relentless. It seeped up from the packed earth floor and pierced through the very walls of the structure. Leo, who had been fighting a cough for days, began to shiver violently. His skin, when she touched his forehead, was blazing hot. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Sarah. The boy's coughs grew deeper, more ragged. His breathing became a shallow, wheezing struggle. She knew this fever. She had seen it take children before. He needed warmth. He needed medicine she did not have. He needed help she could not provide. The storm raged outside, a perfect mirror of the tempest of fear inside her. She held Leo tight, trying to warm him with her own body, whispering reassurances that were swallowed by the thunderous roar of the wind. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Inside his cabin, Elias watched the storm lash against his window panes. This was no ordinary squall. This was a norther, a blast of winter that had arrived with the fury of a vengeful god. He stoked the fire until it roared in the hearth, a bulwark of heat against the assault from outside. He was safe. He was warm, but his thoughts were in the barn. He tried to ignore the worry. They were sheltered. They had the blanket, but the sound of the wind was monstrous. He thought of the boy's small frame. He thought of the cough he'd heard on and off for days. He paced the small cabin, from the door to the hearth, his own unease a growing storm within him. He told himself it was not his concern. He had done enough. Then, during a brief lull in the wind's howl, he heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable, carried on the gale. A child's cry, thin and desperate. It was followed by the sound of his own name, or what he thought was his name, screamed by the woman. Elias! He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat from its peg, the one that had hung there alone for so long, and pulled it on. He lit his big storm lantern, its steady flame a small, defiant star. He braced himself and threw open the cabin door. The wind hit him like a physical blow, threatening to tear the door from his grip and the breath from his lungs. He fought his way out into the maelstrom, leaning into the wind, his boots sinking into the mud that was already inches deep. The short walk to the barn was a brutal battle. Icy rain slashed at his face, and the lantern swung wildly in his hand, casting frantic, dancing shadows. He reached the barn door and had to use all his strength to slide it open against the force of the wind. He stepped inside, and the scene that greeted him stopped his heart. Sarah was on her knees in the hay, clutching Leo to her chest. The boy was limp, his head lolling back, his face pale and slick with sweat in the lantern light. Her own face was a mask of pure terror. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a fear that transcended all her previous caution and pride. "Help him," she begged, her voice a raw whisper. "Please." The storm outside raged, but in that moment, the world for Elias shrank to the terrified face of a mother and the fragile life of her son. The lines he had drawn, the walls he had built, the solitude he had cultivated, all of it was washed away in the flood of that single, desperate plea. He crossed the barn in 3 long strides. He knelt and, without a word, gently took the boy from her arms. Leo was frighteningly light, his body burning with fever even through his damp clothes. Elias wrapped the child in a corner of his own greatcoat, shielding him from the cold. "To the house," he said, his voice a low command against the storm's fury. He stood and turned, expecting her to follow. He carried the boy out into the screaming wind and the driving rain, his broad back protecting the small, feverish body. He had crossed the threshold. He had brought them into his world, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that nothing would ever be the same. He carried the boy into the cabin and straight to his own bed. He laid him down gently on the corn-husk mattress, the child's small form almost lost in the center of it. Sarah followed him in, dripping and shivering, her eyes never leaving her son. She stood uncertainly by the door, clutching her shawl, a refugee washed up on the shore of his quiet life. The wind slammed the door shut behind her with a deafening crack, sealing them inside. The 3 of them, together in the warm, firelit room, a small island in the heart of the storm. Elias moved with a swift, focused purpose that surprised even himself. He stoked the fire until it blazed, casting a warm, orange light over the entire room. He stripped off his own soaked coat and hung it on its peg, where it dripped onto the floorboards. He looked at Sarah. "Get those wet things off him," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. While she fumbled with the boy's damp shirt and trousers, her hands shaking with cold and fear, Elias went to his small cupboard. He pulled out a stone jug of whiskey and a tin of herbs, yarrow and mint. His own mother had taught him their use. He worked at the hearth, boiling water in a small pot, adding the herbs until the air filled with their sharp, clean scent. He ignored Sarah's watchful, worried presence. He focused only on the tasks at hand, brewing the tea, finding a clean rag, checking the boy's breathing. Leo's breaths were shallow, punctuated by a rattling cough that seemed to tear through his small body. Sarah finished undressing her son and wrapped him in the driest of the bed's blankets. She stood helplessly beside the bed, watching Elias. He was a stranger, a man of silence and shadows, yet he moved with a quiet authority that was strangely comforting. He brought a steaming cup of the herbal tea to the bedside. "Hold his head up," he said. She complied, cradling Leo's hot, damp head in her hands. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, and patiently, carefully, spooned the hot liquid into the boy's mouth. Most of it dribbled out, but some of it went down. They worked together, a silent practice team, as if they had been doing this for years. When the tea was gone, Elias soaked a rag in cool water from the bucket and began to bathe the boy's forehead and neck. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard labor, were surprisingly gentle. Sarah watched those hands, the slow, steady way they moved, and felt the tight knot of panic in her chest begin to loosen, just a little. The night wore on. The storm howled outside, a relentless, primal scream. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the boy's labored breathing, and the quiet, rhythmic movements of the man caring for him. Sarah eventually sank into the chair by the hearth, exhaustion finally overwhelming her. She never took her eyes off the bed. She watched Elias sit in the other chair, which he had pulled close to the boy. He didn't sleep. He just sat there, a silent, steadfast guardian, rising every hour to check the fever, to offer a sip of water, to adjust the blankets. Sometime before dawn, in the darkest, coldest hour, the boy's breathing began to change. The ragged, shallow gasps deepened. The rattling in his chest subsided. Elias placed a hand on his forehead. The fire of the fever was still there, but it was no longer a raging inferno. It had banked. He looked over at Sarah. Her head had slumped forward, her body finally surrendering to sleep. He looked back at the boy, who had fallen into a true, deep sleep. His small face relaxed for the first time in hours. Elias felt a profound and unfamiliar sense of peace settle over him. He had fought a battle tonight, not against the storm outside, but against the ghosts inside. He had opened his home. He had cared for a sick child. He had let another human being depend on him. He had not run. He looked at the woman asleep in his chair, and the boy asleep in his bed. His cabin, for so long a bastion of solitude, was full. The silence was no longer empty. It was watchful. It was waiting. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the window, he knew the fever and the storm had broken. By morning, the world was white and still. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick blanket of snow that muffled all sound and transformed the harsh landscape into one of soft, silent beauty. The sun rose in a clean, pale sky, its light sparkling on the pristine snow. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly. Leo was sleeping peacefully, his fever gone, replaced by a healthy sheen of perspiration on his brow. Sarah awoke with a start, disoriented. The light in the room was gentle, the air warm. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory rushed back, the storm, the fever, the terror. She looked frantically toward the bed. She saw Leo, sleeping soundly, and Elias, sitting in the chair beside him, his head resting against the high back, his eyes closed. He hadn't slept, not really, but had drifted into a light doze, ever watchful. She rose from her chair, her joints stiff and sore. She crept over to the bed and laid a hand on her son's forehead. It was cool. The relief was so absolute, so overwhelming, that her knees went weak. Tears she had been too frightened to shed last night now welled in her eyes. She sank to her knees by the bed, burying her face in the rough blankets, and wept silent, grateful tears. Her small movement woke Elias. He opened his eyes and saw her there, her shoulders shaking. He didn't speak. He simply watched her, giving her the space for her grief and her relief. He understood that her tears were for more than just a broken fever. They were for months of fear and hardship, for a loneliness that must have felt as vast as the plains outside. After a few moments, she composed herself. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and stood up. She turned to face him. Her face was pale and drawn in the morning light, but her eyes were clear. "Thank you," she said. The words were soft, but they filled the quiet room. He gave a small nod, accepting her gratitude as a simple fact. He stood and stretched. The weariness of the long night settled in his bones. He moved to the hearth and began to prepare breakfast, his movements once again falling into their familiar solitary rhythm. But it was different now. He was cooking for 3. They were snowed in. For the next 3 days, the cabin became their entire world. The tension that had existed between them, the careful distance, had dissolved in the heat of the crisis. It was replaced by a quiet, comfortable domesticity that was both strange and natural. Sarah took over the cooking, her hands moving with a forgotten grace as she made soups and broth for Leo. Elias kept the fire fed and shoveled a path from the cabin to the well and the woodpile. They spoke very little, but the silence was no longer a wall between them. It was a shared space. A language of gestures took over. A nod of thanks as he brought in a fresh bucket of water. The quiet way she set a plate of food before him at the table. These small acts of care and consideration were more eloquent than words. Leo recovered quickly, his child's resilience a source of wonder. On the second day he was sitting up in bed, and by the third he was exploring the small cabin. He was a curious, quiet boy. He was fascinated by the things on Elias's shelves. A collection of oddly shaped rocks, a bundle of dried herbs, a worn leather-bound book. Elias let him touch everything, watching with a small, unaccustomed smile as the boy traced the letters on the book's cover with his finger. Then Leo discovered the rocking chair. It sat in the darkest corner of the room, an object of silent, sorrowful memory that Elias had trained himself not to see. Leo walked right up to it. He put his small hands on its smooth, worn arms. He gave it a tentative push. It rocked back and forth with a soft, rhythmic creak. The sound filled the cabin, the sound of a ghost stirring. Elias froze. He was standing by the hearth and every muscle in his body went rigid. He watched the boy rock the empty chair, and the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled to dust. The pain was as fresh and sharp as if it were yesterday. Sarah saw the look on his face. She saw the raw, unguarded agony. She quickly went to Leo. "Let's leave that be, honey," she said softly, guiding him away. Leo looked from his mother's gentle face to the stark, pained expression on the cowboy's. He didn't understand, but he obeyed. The creaking stopped. The silence that rushed back in was heavy with unspoken history. Later that evening, as Leo slept soundly in the big bed, Sarah and Elias sat at the small table, a single candle burning between them. "It was my son's," he said, his voice low and rough. The words came out of him as if torn from his very soul. He didn't look at her. He stared at his own hands, resting on the table. "He and my wife, the fever, took them both. 5 years ago." The confession hung in the air between them. It explained everything. The solitude, the silence, the empty peg on the wall, the pain he carried like a shroud. Sarah's heart ached for him. She knew that kind of loss. "We lost our farm," she said, her own voice quiet. "My husband, he worked himself into the grave trying to keep it. Mr. Gable called in a note we didn't even know he held. He took everything. We were just put out, on the road." They sat in silence, their 2 separate griefs filling the small space, weaving together in the flickering candlelight. They were 2 people broken by the harshness of the world, 2 souls who had been wandering alone in the wilderness of their own sorrow. Here, in this small cabin, surrounded by the silent snow, They had found a place to rest. They were no longer strangers. They were survivors. The snow melted as quickly as it had come, revealing a world washed clean. The mud dried, and the road to town became passable again. They were running low on flour, salt, and coffee. A trip was necessary. The prospect of leaving the sanctuary of the ranch filled Sarah with a quiet dread. Out there was the world that had chewed her up and spit her out. Here, in the quiet company of this stoic man, she had begun to feel safe for the first time in a very long time. Elias seemed to feel it too. He was quieter than usual the morning they were to leave, his movements tight with attention she now recognized. He hitched his steady horse, Old Bess, to his buckboard wagon. The splintered wheel on her own wagon still leaned against the barn, a monument to their interrupted journey. He had not worked on it since the storm. He helped her and Leo onto the buckboard seat. His hand brushed hers as he did, a brief, callous touch that sent a jolt of warmth through her. It was the first time they had touched outside of the crisis of Leo's fever. They made the journey to the small town of Redemption in a familiar silence, but it was a silence charged with a new awareness of each other. Leo sat between them, a small, happy bridge, pointing out prairie dogs and hawks along the way. Redemption was little more than a single dusty street lined with a handful of false-fronted buildings. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a land office. As they pulled up in front of the general store, Sarah felt the old anxiety return. People stared. A woman and child with a grim, solitary rancher like Elias Kane was cause for gossip. She pulled her shawl tighter and kept her eyes down. Elias helped them down and tethered the horse. He seemed oblivious to the curious glances, his face set in its usual impassive mask. He followed her and Leo into the store, the bell above the door announcing their arrival with a cheerful, jarring jingle. The store was dim and smelled of pickles, leather, and dust. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man with a bald head and spectacles, nodded at them from behind the counter. Inside, clustered near the fabric bolts, a group of women stopped their chatter to watch them. Sarah felt their eyes on her worn dress, her mended shawl. She kept her focus on her list, her voice low as she asked Mr. Henderson for flour and beans. It was then that the bell on the door jingled again. A large man filled the doorway, blocking out the light. He was well dressed in a dark suit and a bowler hat, his belly straining the buttons of his waistcoat. A thick gold watch chain was draped across his middle. Sarah's blood ran cold. It was Mr. Gable. He strode into the store as if he owned it, which Sarah knew he nearly did. His eyes scanned the room, and a smug, cruel smile spread across his face when he saw her. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice filling the small space. "Look what the wind blew in. Sarah Miller. I thought you'd be halfway to California by now." Sarah froze, her hand hovering over a sack of sugar. She could feel every eye in the store on her. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. "Still wandering, are you?" Gable continued, stepping closer. "Living on handouts, I imagine. A woman alone with a boy. One has to do what one must to get by, I suppose." The insinuation was vile, unmistakable. The women by the fabric bolts whispered behind their hands. Mr. Henderson suddenly found something fascinating to polish on his counter. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over Sarah. She felt Leo press against her leg, sensing her distress. She lifted her chin, her voice trembling but clear. "We are fine, Mr. Gable." "Fine?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You call this fine? Living off the charity of strangers?" He gestured vaguely toward Elias, who had been standing silently by the tool display, watching. "I'm surprised even a recluse like Kane would take in stray dogs." That was when Elias moved. He didn't hurry. He took 2 slow, deliberate steps that placed him directly between Gable and Sarah. He was not as large as Gable, but he seemed to take up all the air in the room. His face was like carved stone, his eyes chips of cold, gray flint. He didn't look at Gable. He looked at Sarah. He reached out and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The gesture was possessive, protective, final. He then turned his gaze to Gable. The temperature in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "She's with me," he said. The 3 words hung in the air, simple and absolute. It was not an explanation. It was a declaration, a statement of fact, a line drawn in the dust of the general store floor. "She belongs here, with me. You will not touch her." Gable's smug smile faltered. He looked from Elias's unyielding face to the hand resting on Sarah's shoulder. He was a bully, accustomed to people cowering. He did not know what to do with a man who would not. He sputtered for a moment, then seemed to think better of it. He gave a dismissive snort, adjusted his hat, and turned on his heel, striding out of the store. The silence he left behind was profound. The whispering stopped. Elias did not remove his hand from Sarah's shoulder. He turned to the stunned Mr. Henderson. "We'll take the flour," he said, his voice back to its normal, quiet tone. "And sugar, a bag of coffee, and one of those peppermint sticks for the boy." He paid for the supplies with coins from a worn leather pouch. He gathered the sacks in his strong arms and, with his hand now resting lightly on the small of Sarah's back, he guided her and Leo out of the store, leaving the gawking townsfolk of Redemption behind them. As they stepped out into the bright sunlight, Sarah felt as though she could breathe again. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her. In front of the whole world, he had built a wall around her and dared anyone to cross it. And in that moment, she knew she was no longer adrift. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than ever, but the silence was now laden with the weight of what had happened. Elias's public declaration echoed in the space between them. "She's with me." The words had been a shield in the store. Now they were a question hanging in the open air. What did they mean? Sarah stole glances at him. His profile was stark against the wide sky, his jaw set, his eyes on the horizon. He offered no explanation, no softening of his grim expression. Yet the way he held the reins seemed less tense. The hard lines around his eyes seemed to have eased. He had stood for her. He had faced down the man who had ruined her life and had done so without hesitation. The gratitude she felt was so immense it was a physical presence, a warmth spreading through her chest. When they arrived back at the cabin, the familiar landscape felt different. It no longer seemed like a temporary refuge. It felt like coming home. The routine they fell back into was subtly changed. The line between the cabin and the barn, already blurred, now seemed to vanish entirely. Sarah began taking their meals in the cabin, sitting opposite him at the small table. Leo, emboldened by the peppermint stick and the security of Elias's protection, chattered away, filling the quiet spaces with his innocent observations about clouds and cattle. Elias would listen, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He went back to work on her wagon, but his pace was unhurried. He would spend an hour or 2 on it in the late afternoons, meticulously shaping a new fellow for the wheel, his movements patient and precise. It was clear to Sarah that he was in no hurry to finish the job. He was not fixing it for her to leave. He was fixing it because it was broken, and he was a man who mended broken things. She, in turn, began to tend to the cabin. It was his space, and she was careful not to overstep, but she brought a woman's touch to the starkly masculine room. She scrubbed the floorboards until they shone. She washed the single window until the light streamed in, clear and bright. One day, while walking by the creek, she found a patch of late-blooming Indian paintbrush. She picked a small bouquet and put it in a glass jar on the center of the table. When Elias came in for supper that evening, he stopped in the doorway and just looked at the splash of vibrant red on his table. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. Sarah saw the look in his eyes. The days softened into weeks. The harshness of the plains summer gave way to the golden light of autumn. The land, which had seemed so hostile and empty, now revealed a subtle beauty. Elias began to talk more, not in long speeches, but in small offerings. He would point out a hawk circling high overhead and name it. He would explain how to read the clouds to predict the weather. He was teaching them his world, sharing the silent language of the land he knew so well. He started teaching Leo how to whittle. He gave the boy a small, dull-bladed knife and a piece of soft pine. He would sit with him on the porch steps in the evenings, his large, scarred hands guiding the boy's small ones, showing him how to shave off thin curls of wood. Leo's first project was a lopsided, barely recognizable boat, but he was immensely proud of it. He showed it to his mother, his face glowing. "My boat," he announced. "Elias made it." "No, son," Elias said quietly, his eyes on the boy. "You made it." The sound of Leo's laughter, once so rare, became a common music around the ranch. It echoed off the barn as he chased butterflies. It rang out from the porch as Elias told him a story about a clever coyote. The sound seemed to heal the very air, smoothing over old griefs and filling the lonely spaces. Sarah watched it all, her heart swelling. She saw the transformation in her son, from a fearful, clinging child to a confident, happy boy. And she saw the transformation in Elias. The deep, settled sadness in his eyes was being replaced by a quiet contentment. The walls he had built around himself were not just breached. They were crumbling away, stone by stone, under the gentle assault of a child's laughter and a woman's quiet care. One evening, Elias came back from his workshop and pressed a small object into Leo's hand. It was a perfectly carved wooden horse, its mane and tail detailed with intricate knife work. It was a thing of beauty, made with patience and love. Leo gasped, his eyes wide with wonder. He clutched the horse to his chest as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. Sarah looked at Elias, her eyes shining. She opened her mouth to thank him, but no words came. There were no words big enough. He just gave her a small nod, his gaze soft. In that moment, looking at the three of them, a man, a woman, and a child, bathed in the warm lamplight of the cabin. She knew the question that had been hanging in the air since their trip to town had an answer. The wagon could be fixed. The road was open. But her journey was over. She was home. Autumn deepened, painting the cottonwoods by the creek a brilliant gold. The nights grew crisp and clear, filled with a vast silence that was no longer lonely but peaceful. The rhythm of their life was set, a quiet melody of shared work and comfortable companionship. The half-repaired wagon will leaned against the barn, forgotten. It was no longer a symbol of departure, but a relic of a past life. One evening, the air held the first real chill of the coming winter. A fire blazed in the hearth, its light dancing on the wooden walls of the cabin. Leo was asleep in the big bed, the small wooden horse clutched in his hand. Elias sat at the table, mending a piece of leather harness, his head bent in concentration, the light glinting off his dark hair. Sarah sat in the chair opposite him, darning one of Leo's socks, her needle moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of her thread passing through the wool. She finished her work and set the sock aside. She watched him, the way the firelight carved shadows and highlights on his strong, quiet face. She thought of the man he had been when she first arrived, a fortress of solitude and grief. And she looked at the man he was now, a man who had carved a toy for her son, who had stood for her against the world, who had shared the warmth of his home and, slowly, his heart. The time for silence was over. Some things needed to be said aloud, to be given the weight of words. "I want to stay," she said. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the quiet of the room. Elias's hands stilled. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers across the table. The firelight flickered in their depths. He didn't speak, but she saw the question there, the hope warring with a lifetime of caution. She wanted him to understand completely, to know the depth of her feeling, the entirety of what she was offering. It wasn't just shelter she wanted. It was a life, a future, family. "I want to stay," she repeated, her voice stronger now, unwavering, "and build a life here, with you." The air in the room grew thick with the weight of her declaration. It was everything he had secretly begun to hope for, a possibility he hadn't dared to name even to himself. He looked at her, at the honesty and strength shining in her face. He looked over at the sleeping boy, a child who had come to feel like his own. And then his gaze drifted, as it still sometimes did, to the wall by the door. To the empty peg beside his own coat. For 5 years that peg had been a shrine. It had held his wife's winter cloak. He had left it there after she was gone. A stubborn, painful monument to what he had lost. It was a promise he had made to her memory. A tradition of grief that kept him chained to the past. Keeping it there meant he would never forget, but it also meant he could never move on. It meant this home could never truly be shared. With a slowness that felt momentous, he pushed his chair back and stood up. He walked to the wall. He stood before the empty peg, his back to her. Sarah held her breath, her heart pounding. This was his answer. He reached up. His hand hovered for a second. Then he took down the heavy sheepskin coat that had hung there for years. Not his wife's, but his own, the one he had worn into the storm to save her son. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to the large wooden chest at the foot of the bed. He lifted the lid. He carefully, deliberately, folded the heavy coat and placed it inside. He closed the lid with a soft, final thud. It was a quiet, simple act, but it was the most profound statement he could have made. He was breaking his own tradition. He was putting away the symbol of his solitary, protected life. He was clearing a space for her. He walked back to the table and stood before her. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. His touch was warm and firm. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, she saw all the walls were gone. There was no more grief, no more shadows. There was only a quiet, steady light. He didn't need to say the words. She had her answer. Spring came, and with it a gentle greening of the land. The creek ran full and clear, and the prairie grasses grew tall, swaying in the warm breeze. The wagon, its wheel now fully mended, sat beside the barn not as a vehicle for escape, but as a useful tool for hauling supplies. It was a part of the ranch now, just as they were. They planted a garden. Elias tilled the rich soil behind the cabin, a patch of earth that had lain fallow for years. Sarah, with Leo's eager help, planted rows of beans, squash, and corn. They worked together under the wide prairie sky, their hands in the dirt, putting down roots. He showed Leo how to drop the seeds into the furrows. She showed him how to water them, her voice a soft hum as she explained how things grow with sun, water, and care. Life settled into a new and beautiful rhythm. The cabin was no longer just his. It was theirs. Her wildflower bouquets were a permanent fixture on the table. The small wooden rocker, once a monument to sorrow, was now pulled up near the hearth, a favorite spot for Leo to sit and listen as Elias told him stories in the evenings. The sound of its gentle creaking was no longer a ghost's lament, but a lullaby. Elias taught the boy to ride, placing him in front of him on the saddle of his steady old horse. He held Leo secure as they rode the fence lines, his deep voice pointing out the simple wonders of their world. Sarah would watch them from the porch, her heart a full and aching thing in her chest. She would often sing as she worked, old songs her own mother had taught her. The sound of her voice, clear and sweet, would drift out from the cabin, a thread of music weaving itself into the fabric of their days. From silence had come warmth. From hardship, a home had been built, not with timber and nails, but with small gestures of kindness and fierce acts of protection. Love had grown in the unlikeliest of places, a stubborn wildflower pushing its way through the hard, cracked earth of two wounded hearts. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in glorious strokes of orange and rose, they sat together on the porch steps. Leo was asleep inside, tired out from a day of helping his father, for that is what Elias now was, mend a section of fence. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that needs no words. The air was soft, smelling of dust, grass, and the promise of a peaceful night. He reached over and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, trusting gesture that spoke of a deep and abiding peace. His arm came around her, holding her close. They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. The hook by the door, where his heavy coat had once hung as a shield against the world, was not empty. A lighter work jacket now hung there, worn from the day's labor and ready for the mornings. A new promise for a new life. Her hand rested on his. She stayed.